Welcome back to part 3 of the Ghost of Tsushima critique. My name is Luke Stephens, your humble host. Glad to have you. If you haven't seen part 1 or part 2, apparently both are 2. If you haven't seen part 1 or part 2, links in the description box right underneath the like button for you to check those out before we talk about this. But today we're talking about the game's narrative. Ghost of Tsushima is a phenomenal game. So far we've looked at the world design, the combat. Today we're talking about the story, what it does well, and also what it fails to capitalize on, because there are a few things that I think would have been fantastic additions and things that I hope to see in a sequel. If you like the video, make sure to hit that like button, and if you want to see part 4 when we discuss the DLC and our overarching thoughts of the game next Monday, make sure to subscribe for that. But with that said, let's get into it. The first thing I want to say is that Ghost of Tsushima's narrative works fantastically well to motivate the player's actions within the world. This is something that's actually really hard to pull off well. Other open world games have failed fantastically at this, namely a game like Fallout 4. Fallout 4 motivates the player to navigate the world by, spoilers, telling you that your son has been abducted, and then you are motivated to explore the wastes in order to find your son. However, there is a very strict main story path that you're expected to follow if you want to find your son. The problem is that doing literally anything outside of that main story campaign does not jive with what they've tried to motivate you to do. It doesn't jive with the story, it doesn't jive with the main character's motivations. If you're role-playing in any sort of meaningful way, that's because if you are looking for your son out in the wastes because he's been kidnapped, and to your best knowledge he's a toddler or an infant, you are not gonna stop to just explore a building or stop to just go and screw around trying to collect ammo from a bunch of raiders. You're not gonna go collecting bobbleheads. You're gonna try to find your son because he's missing. This is why the implications of the main story are so important in an open world game. If you don't do this well, role-playing is almost entirely out the window. The only way you can really role-play in a game like Fallout 4 is if you either blast through the main story until you resolve the issue of your son's disappearance, and then you explore the open world, or you just check out of the main story, kind of ignore it, don't take it seriously, and just do everything else, and then start role-playing in the role of a father after the fact, after in-game months have passed of your son just being missing. And some people can do that, some people can't. I personally struggle with, I guess, doing that type of thing where I kind of check out of role play until I reach a certain point. I can't do that. I want to just role play and be in the moment with the character, but this is a personal thing. What I will say is that Ghost of Tsushima, it doesn't matter because they do it fantastically well. You see, in Ghost of Tsushima, when you're clearing camps, exploring island caves, crevices to clear out Mongol hideouts, or you just are looking for people to fight, it all makes sense within the narrative premises that have been established. Hell, even pausing to rest and write haikus makes sense tonally in the context of the game's world. And this is probably the singular best thing about Ghost of Tsushima's narrative and why I'm starting with it, because it unifies the combat and gameplay experience so well with the main story. You're trying to defend the island from Mongol invaders, and literally everything you can do in the game's world reinforces that idea. And it's so well done. And it makes immersion so much easier. Now, in the last part, when we discussed combat, we outlined that it gets pretty repetitious. You'll be doing a lot of the same thing over and over and over again. And that's just part of what happens in these games. There's only so much you can do. But one of the things that makes it easier to deal with that repetition is that all of the side quests and the main story content, while the core gameplay mechanic at its core is repeated throughout, the individual motivations for each of those quests are changed, and there are interesting stories tied to them. For example, this quest is called Lost at Sea, and it's pretty simple. A father has had his daughter kidnapped, and so he asks you for help, and if you agree, he'll row you out to a small Mongol ship for you to save her. It's just a combat challenge, but that combat challenge has its own narrative context and motivator. So it's the same thing you've been doing the whole game, but it's unique and stands out in your memory. Or this quest called The Burden of Theft, which is probably the most memorable side quest that I did in the entire game. I'm not entirely sure why, but let me explain it. You find a monk that's died trying to seemingly hide a small statue. The Mongols seem to have gotten the jump on him, and he died after frantically burying this small statue in a small flower bed. It seems like this statue held some sort of religious significance to the monk, so he was burying it to protect it and keep it out of Mongol hands. So after you clear out the Mongol invaders, you take the statuette and you bring it back to the temple where it came from, just nearby. But soon after you arrive at the monastery, you're instructed by the remaining monks that the one you found on the street burying the statuette was no monk at all. Rather, he was a thief. You see, he was a peasant that was staying at the monastery once the invasion started, but he ran off in the middle of the night with the statue, assuming that it was valuable. And he also stole one of the other monks' robes so that it would seem like he was a monk just like they were, and perhaps would be left alone if jumped by the Mongols. But of course, the Mongols didn't care, and once they found him, they just jumped him and tried to kill him. So even though it seemed at first like this was just another examples of the Mongols being terrible and the people on the island being pure and totally blameless, it's showing an instance of the types of people that take advantage of wartime situations, who take advantage of other people's kindnesses, and it shows the necessary consequences of those types of things. And it just stood out as a very memorable quest line, because it could have been that it was just a monk who got jumped by Mongols while trying to go to a shrine, and that's all it is. But instead, the writers and the designers added in this extra stuff to add complexity to that quest's narrative, make it more memorable, and make it stand out. It's that little bit of extra effort that makes things like this memorable and stand out, and I love it. I mean, even now, a year after I first played this quest, I still remember it like it was yesterday. And one thing that makes me appreciate it even more is that it is on a very small section of the map near Benke's Falls, I think it's pronounced. And it's an area on the main map that really isn't utilized in the main story. Very few people will find this unless they are actively exploring the world, which of course you should be doing because it's fantastic. And finding a small quest like this that only triggers while you're exploring this portion of the map just makes the player go, wow, that was awesome. I want to explore every nook and cranny of this map, because if stuff like that happens at just random locations, I wonder what else I could find. And that's what helps these worlds come alive and feel worthy of exploration. It works so well. It really does deserve high praise. However, it's not all perfect. There are issues. The first thing I have to say, and the reason I put it in the narrative section, is because it's tied to cutscenes. When the game launched, almost every single scene was bookended at the beginning and end by a fade to black, an aggressive fade to black. Literally everything you did, fade to black, fade back in. You walk over here, you press interact, fade to black, fade back in. It drove me absolutely nuts. I hate fade to blacks. I think they should be used very sparingly. I think they are sort of like the lazy copy and paste transition. I just think it's stupid. You shouldn't use fade to blacks unless absolutely necessary. Come up with something a little more creative or interesting. And they used it very aggressively. However, this apparently was a technological restriction with the engine on the base PS4. With the director's cut on PlayStation 5, this really is not very noticeable at all, because the fades are so quick, you really can't tell or notice that it's a thing. In the PS4 version of the game, it fades to black to transition models out between the cutscene versions of the models and load back in the gameplay versions of the models of characters and higher resolution textures and things like that. But with the PS5's SSD, you don't even have to worry about it. So this is an example of one of those things that seems like an artistic choice at first, but it was actually born out of a technological restriction. And I'm glad to say that in the director's cut on PS5, this isn't really an issue. But if you're playing on PS4, it will drive you insane. But okay, with that pedantic, kind of whiny, complainy thing out of the way, what are some things that the narrative itself does that isn't that great? Well, I've got a couple of examples. For one, I'm just gonna say it. It doesn't make any damn sense why the Mongols would leave Jin unattended after he's captured. He is literally the most dangerous man on the entire island, and he's also the most valuable man on the island, especially to the Khan. And so it doesn't make any damn sense why they would take the risk of just leaving him sitting here totally unattended and unwatched. They know that he's capable of doing great feats of stealth, of assassinating people, of escaping tight situations, because he's done it many times in their camps before. So it just doesn't make any sense why they would leave him alone when all it would take would be a couple of Mongol guards to sit here and stare at him for 24 hours a day to make sure he doesn't wiggle out of his restraints. It doesn't make any sense at all. It's not a big deal, but I just would have liked to see something a little more thought through than just, oh, he was abandoned and then he escapes. Wow. That's crazy. It doesn't feel natural. It feels contrived. And it's one of the issues I've had with other games, such as The Last of Us Part 2, where things felt very contrived. The writers wanted X to happen, so they had to make sure everything aligned for that to occur. If they want Z to happen, they've got to line up Y so that it leads to Z. And the reason that's a problem is because it totally ruins the immersion. If you're paying attention to the story, and you're trying to think what makes sense, to see some enemy do something that just totally is illogical and objectively really dumb pulls you out of it. It's not to say that enemies or people in real life don't do dumb things. Of course they do. But when you're writing a story, relying on people's stupidity doesn't really work for me. And I'm just trying to be consistent. I criticized The Last of Us Part 2 for having contrived sequences, such as having Abby just happen to stumble on Joel and Tommy in the middle of a snowstorm that happened to be going on right as they arrive from Seattle after months of travel. I thought that was contrived. I thought it was a little silly, especially because other introductory sequences would have worked just as well, with Abby and her squad actually going into Jackson and getting familiarized with the town and the townspeople, earning their trust before jumping Tommy and Joel when they had the chance. That would have made more sense and that wouldn't have felt contrived, but they chose to construct that scene in a way where everything just lined up perfectly for this thing to happen that they had decided they wanted to happen in the first place. And there's a few instances in the game of small details like this where you can tell they had decided the story beat before they wrote how that story beat occurs. So it just kind of feels like they had to push things into position to make them happen. Again, it's not a big deal, and it's something that very few people will actually give a crap about, but it stood out to me. I have to mention it. Not a big deal, but it's there. One thing I was surprised was not present at the game at all were these temporary status effects that I think could have been really, really cool in the game, especially later on when you're dealing with really cold climates as you head further north. And I know that they thought about this and wanted to draw this out even further because Jin even has dialogue saying that it's very cold in the northern lands and that he needs to stay warm to stay safe. And so it could have been interesting to add things such as an extra layer of armor or specialty armor that you need to wear when in the snowy sections that perhaps slows you down a lot, making combat more difficult, but it keeps you warm so that you don't have like a steady health depletion from the cold effect. Just something small like that I think could have gone a long way and helped with the immersion of being in a further north area, of this part of the map being totally different from this part. But it's not really here, except for in one spot. The only time they actually do a status effect is when you get close to the mountaintop or begin to climb it. And this is because there's a quest related to the hike up the mountain that will give the player access to the flaming sword ability. And to get it, you have to climb up the mountain and stop at campfires along the way to stay warm. It could have been a really cool moment to try and get the player thinking outside the box to climb up the mountain fast enough, or even just to test how efficiently somebody would be able to explore the trails, die, and then remember the route that they had taken up the mountain. Could have been interesting, but they don't really do it here. It's just about running basically from checkpoint to checkpoint to checkpoint. One of my frustrations is that when I first arrived at the mountain, I didn't trigger the quest that allows you to stop at the campfires. So I just started trying to climb up the mountain thinking that it was just a challenge to me as the player to navigate or find the secret passageway up in time. So I spent a solid half hour just running up the mountain from different angles and trying different routes before I realized I was probably missing something. I know, not every game can be Breath of the Wild. Not every game can offer you the chance to eat peppers to heat you up or to light torches to stay warm. I understand that. But having that level of dynamism, having that amount of player exploration and experimentation goes a long way. And I think even something as simple as finding a nice armor set that has externalities in terms of effects on combat, exploration, speed of navigation could have been really interesting, and I think it would have made this whole thing more dynamic. I mean, as has been the case with most of the critiques we've made in this series, a lot of the things that I find frustrating about Ghost of Tsushima aren't major issues. They aren't issues that are foundational and are problems with the main story writing or the justification for the narrative, like Cyberpunk 2077 with all of its foundational issues, core design choices that just don't work together. That's not here. This is a very fluid and very competently put together game. Our critiques here are mostly to just refine the experience, to try and make it just that much better, add a little bit more, a little salt, a little pepper. It's basically a phenomenal steak, a fantastic Wagyu beef steak, and all it needs is a little bit of seasoning to make it really explode. It's already fantastic, but it could use just a little bit of something to complement it and make it work a little bit better. So don't take these critiques as me just trying to tear the game apart, because even trying to come up with things to point at, to improve and fix or change, it's hard to come up with stuff because Ghost of Tsushima is so fantastic. But there still are things that can be refined, added, and that I think could be done in the sequel to make it really stand out. And speaking of things that are really hard to critique, let's look at a couple of examples of fantastic narrative touches that I think are worthy of praise. There's a moment towards the end of the game where your horse dies that you've been playing with for the entirety of the main story, and it's actually a pretty solemn moment. I didn't expect this to hit me very hard, but it's actually a very sad story beat. You spend so much time with your horse over the course of the game, you actually do build a real connection that I didn't even realize was being built while playing. I also really like the focus on stealth beginning in Act 2 and moving forward, and especially I like the use of poison and hallucinogenic darts and other tools in the stealth category that are used later in the game, especially because narratively they come back to haunt Jin almost immediately. Once Jin starts using poison on the Mongols discover that same poison and start to use it on civilians. It just goes to show you what goes around comes around. And if you're playing dirty, your enemies are probably going to start playing dirty too. And sometimes rising or perhaps lowering to your opponent's level isn't always the right thing to do. And that's a theme that's carried through the entire main story. The idea that Jin needs to use honor, he needs to fight like a samurai, he shouldn't be doing this stealthy, ghostly stuff. He needs to stand up and fight the Mongols like an honorable man. But the whole point is that sometimes that's not actually a viable option. Sometimes you need to get in there and fight dirty in order to win. You know, your pride and your nobility and your honor is valuable, but you have to weigh that against the pragmatic consideration of what's going to be effective. And it's something that Jin fights with his uncle constantly about throughout the main story. And it really hits a peak towards the end of the game when, of course, Jin uses poison on the entire Mongol encampment, killing dozens of them in one fell swoop. It's a narrative beat that I would have loved to see explored in a game like Assassin's Creed Valhalla. The idea of having a Viking who starts to use stealth. Everybody around him is like, what are you doing? You're a Viking. Go out, fight, crush skulls, do this, like go crazy. But then he's using stealth to further his clan's standing and protections and all of that. I would have loved to see this type of discussion on tactics and the implication of those tactics in the narrative actually explored in a game like Valhalla, but I mean, they just didn't. They had 100+ hours of gameplay to do it, and they just didn't. An example of why a game like Ghost of Tsushima stands out as exceptional in comparison to, you know, a standard Ubisoft game, because that type of opportunity is just totally missed in Valhalla, whereas it's focused on and really explored in Ghost of Tsushima very, very well. In the same vein, the final moments of the game remind me a lot of the play The Crucible. The idea that pride and one's commitments to tradition and their own beliefs must supersede above all else, otherwise there's no foundation upon which anything can stand. It's really interesting to me. Jin's uncle is devastated at the thought of having to take the life of one he considers to be his son, but he knows that he has to do it if his beliefs in honor and tradition hold any merit at all. In the same way that John Proctor at the end of The Crucible decides to face death because it will be the only thing that retains his honor, his name. He has to choose that, otherwise he has nothing backing up who he is at his core. It's one of those moments when you're fighting your uncle at the very end of the game, you don't feel good about it, you don't feel bad about it, you understand why your uncle feels the need to engage in this fight with you, because everything he's ever believed would require that action to be performed, even if he doesn't want to commit or perform that action. So in many ways, engaging with him in that combat is an honor to him. And the last moment, as you honor your uncle with a warrior's death after fighting him, you can actually feel Jin's heartbeat increasing in the DualSense controller on the PlayStation 5 as he works up the courage to do that which isn't easy, but that which is honorable in his uncle's eyes. It's a fantastic touch. For anybody that says quality vibration and haptics is not actually a beneficial thing that can be used in a game in any sort of meaningful way, this is a fantastic example where you're actually feeling the heart rate rise as the character works up the courage to do this thing he really doesn't want to do. It's a phenomenal touch. And even now, like I'm talking about, it gives me chills. It was so cool, really. But all of this to say, Ghost of Tsushima's narrative is fantastic. It ties together the combat, the world exploration, everything thematically works extremely well. It's cohesive, it's fluid, it's competent, it's refined. There's really not a lot that can be said to criticize it. I'm not going to do the thing like I saw in one review back in the day. Somebody was like, I'm really bummed that there aren't a lot of romance options for Jin. I would have loved to see that. You know, like, that's so stupid. Like, not every game needs that. I'm not going to do that kind of thing. I think what's here is lean and serves the purposes of the game's story, world, the thematic choices fantastically well. Sometimes less is more. And sure, we could say that Jin is a little bland in terms of portrayal. We could say that there's not a lot to show a ton of vulnerability. But as far as I could tell, that's in character for Jin. It lines up with the family traditions, it lines up with cultural traditions. It feels very fair to the character, especially towards the end of the game when you see Jin torn down just about as low down to the bottom of the barrel as you could possibly be, and then he builds himself back up to take on the Khan once and for all. And it feels very reasonable at the end. It doesn't feel contrived in any way. For a sequel, I don't know what the story looks like. I don't know if they move to a different island and try it again. I don't know if you have a different protagonist set in the same islands. I don't know what that looks like. And I'm not sure if I have any suggestions or ideas on what they should or shouldn't do. But I would be interested in hearing your thoughts in the comments section. If you have any ideas for what they should do for a potential sequel, whether it's spiritual successor or a direct sequel, I'm not sure. It's one of those things, like, it's done so well in this game. I don't know what you add in a sequel that wouldn't just feel like you're cashing in on the franchise name once again. You know, it's my frustration right now with Horizon Forbidden West. It doesn't feel like it adds enough to really be a standalone phenomenal game. It really feels like they're just doing Horizon Zero Dawn 1.5, which is good. It's a good game, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't excite you. It doesn't make you feel like there's a lot that's here that's worth exploring in and of itself. In many ways, it feels like you've already seen all of this. You're just seeing it again in a bigger scale, if that makes sense. But Ghost of Tsushima, man, it's fantastic. It really is. But that's going to do it for me. Thank you for hanging out. Thanks for watching and subscribing and liking. I appreciate it greatly. As always, if you have any thoughts, leave them in the comments section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. It really does help. And subscribe to get notified next Monday when we put the DLC discussion and the final part of the Ghost of Tsushima critique up on the channel. Monday, 10 a.m. Pacific time, I think is what it's scheduled for. So we'll see you there. Go check out one of these other videos or head over to the Twitch stream. I will probably be streaming live at this very moment that this video is going up. So if you just watched it, head over there, come over, say hi. I would love to see you. But that's it. Much love. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.